Totally. I know that we've talked about like some of the like conservation efforts in the state of Maine, and I know that like you have kind of your hands in some of the areas around you at least and have some knowledge around that. And I'm curious like how those conservation efforts are affecting the sport and just, your guiding.
It's a big question.
It is a big question.
Yeah. So let's take one river for example and dive down it. So the Crooked River feeds Sebago. It's one of the primary tributaries. Sebago Clean Waters is one of the organizations that helps conserve the land. But there's a lot of other partners that are involved in that. So like Loon Echo Land Trust does conservation work there. Trout Unlimited's done like dam removals. But it's also home to, they estimate it's up to 99% of the landlocked salmon run from Sebago spawn in the Crooked River. Mm-hmm. So the problem with the Crooked is that it's a true freestone in the sense that like all the dams are now broken down. So from its headwaters up in Songo Pond, north of Waterford, it flows all the way to the Crooked, or all the way to the Sebago. And there's nothing really impeding other fish moving in and out. So it's susceptible to all the same climate change things that we're seeing across the state. So like seasons are shrinking, fish are moving earlier and later for their like spring and fall migrations. And then on top of that, like Sebago has a big invasive fish problem. Mm-hmm. So like pike was introduced, lake trout was introduced, smallmouth bass was introduced, and then largemouth were introduced illegally. The other three were introduced by the department in fisheries and wildlife at various times to increase angler, experience, right? Not knowing that like the decline they were seeing in the salmon population was being affected by the actions of what they were doing. Mm. So now there's this huge effort to kind of like reverse course. So there's like a kill derby, ice fishing tournament in February for lake trout and pike. Inland Fisheries and Wildlife is like electroshocking and killing pike. But just the other week I was talking to someone, so they're doing like a smolt count. So smolt are like juvenile salmon that are falling back through the river into the lake. Very low smolt numbers this year. And in that process, they electroshocked and killed this pike that was 26 pounds. And inside of it, it had an 18-inch salmon in its stomach. So if you think about like just the damage that did, that's like a perfect spawning size salmon. Right. So we're never going to get pike and lake trout out of Sebago. It's too big. Yeah. They're too endemic. They're here to stay. Smallies are even worse. I mean, the Rapid River, which used to be like the Rangeley destination, like they can't get smallmouth out of there. It's done. So like there feels like this timer on all of these rivers that's impacting like what we're doing. Mm-hmm. There's a flip side of it that is like the rivers in which like salmon and brook trout were kind of already extirpated. Like there's an opportunity there for a guide, right? So like all summer long you can guide for bass, for pike. Like that's a great opportunity, especially for people like learning to fish. Like pound for pound, those are really fun fish to fly fish for, and they take flies. Like that's another problem, right? Like not all fish will like readily take a fly. Like muskie's a great example up on St. John. But the point being is like there's these challenges, and the Crooked is one of these like fragile. It's one of the 4 native salmon lakes and systems in the entire state. Everything else is stocked or wild at this point. So I guide on the Crooked very selectively because it's a very fragile river. But it's my home water, and I can't help it. I love it. I love it so much. It's such a fun river. There's huge salmon in there, but you can feel it become harder. And so that's like a place I would take a client who's like, I really want to tap into something special, and I'm willing to not catch a fish to get that. Mm. And like that's a rare person. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? But it's how I fish the Crooked. Like I don't go there expecting to like kill it. Like if I was up at like the Kennebec, I'd be like in like the summer, I'd be pretty devastated if I didn't catch a fish, to be honest. Yeah. Hasn't happened yet, knock on wood. Yeah. But the Crooked's the opposite of that. Like I actually expect it to be really hard. But it's like this beautiful stream, and it's a piece of history now. Whether or not we're able to be successful, and I know Inland Fisheries and Wildlife is trying super hard, but it feels like, kind of Sisyphus, where every time there's a win, like taking a dam out or something, it's like you learn something like, oh, here's these monster pike just waiting for these salmon to swim by.
Yeah.
So it's tough in that sense.
Good news and bad news.
Yeah. And, I was talking to another guide about this, and, pike are going to be in every water in Maine, is what that something like. Like, maybe not literally, but like, there's some backcountry ponds they won't get to, but like, we are losing like salmon and trout water every single year. Mm-hmm. And Maine's home to over 90% of like native wild brook trout habitat in the entire country. So to be like, we're the last stronghold, and it's part of what makes guiding in Maine so special, right? But there's just a limited amount of that opportunity that's accessible to the public, because all of these kind of more publicly accessible waterways are getting a lot of pressure from invasive species or climate change in a way that, like, some of the remote stuff will just, that stuff will stay, right? But it's a challenge.
So this is the time, because sadly it sounds like you won't be able to do this for much longer, depending on how things go. I mean, it just depends.
It just depends. Yeah, there's no crystal ball, and maybe like conservation efforts will get better as we learn more, right? But you know, there's some things we could do, I think, as a society. But you know, I think that now's the time. I mean, now is definitely the time, because you know, as water's warm, you know, and the habitat reduces. But it will present other opportunities, like I said. Like, one of the things we're really going to push hard for this year is guiding more like smallmouth bass and pike, because there's waters in which they've been here, and they've been here for a while, and they're not going anywhere. And I mean, there's some smallmouth bass waters here that rival any of the best waters from the northern Midwest at this point. You know, like this past weekend, I caught a trophy smallmouth that I know, like an outfitter in Wisconsin, that like if you catch like a 20-inch smallmouth, your name and your picture and the size of it goes on like their wall. And like,
you need one of these walls. For
I do need one of these walls. But I like caught one of these fish, and it was like out of like a pretty small stream with a buddy of mine. And I was like, this is nuts. Like, are we gonna become the best smallmouth fishery state like in the country? You know, obviously, like in that moment, it felt like that, but like, you know, probably not actually. But it is like, there are awesome opportunities to be had. So it's not always like glass half empty, I guess is what I'm saying. But the nature of the fishery is changing, and that's really important, I think, to understand, because people have this idea of like trophy brook trout, Maine, like I'm gonna come do that, and it's like, okay, that's great, but your window's going to be narrow, or you're going to have to go really far for it, which is different than that like new kind of learning the sport, let's have fun like thing. So like in the Portland area especially, like those windows are just really narrow, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, and I think the piece with that, right, is, you know, you talked about like there are some things that like we can't control a decision that was made 10, 20, 30 years ago. Right. And so it's kind of like that age-old phrase of like, from the education perspective, the best day to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best day is today, right? So starting to plant those seeds of some of those educational pieces of like why these things matter, right? Because plenty of those decisions are based around whether it's the, you know, these different conservation organizations doing a lot of educational content around it. And a lot of these things are like, they come up in town meetings and votes, and like that's like where a lot of those decisions come from. So if that educational process can occur, right, then at least maybe we don't make that same decision in 2028 as we did in 1998. You know what I mean, or whatever the thing is. And you know, so I think that's another piece. And you know, one of the things that has really come from a number of the different conversations that we've had on this podcast is just that. Like, half of this is just awareness, right? Like, it is intro level education, like educational content that if someone is not super familiar with a part of this industry that we know is massive, at least we get you the cliff notes, right? And then we can do a deeper dive episode, and Isaac can go way down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, you don't want me on my soapbox. We'll be here until well after dark.
Dude, Google Workspace does have a lot of space, so
yeah, get the drive upload started. But I think that's half the battle, is like you don't care about what you don't love, and you don't love what you don't know, right? So like getting people exposed to like how fish are just around any of the recreation, whether you're canoeing or boating or ice skating, you know, like, you know, it's all connected, right? And then like that's another whole message I think that's interesting in being in New England, is like all these watersheds are connected, you know, in some way or the other, and they all have a story to tell, and it's just fun to be a small part of it.